Deer season's already started in a couple of states and getting ready to open in many more. One of the biggest things we all need to understand to be able to see and harvest deer is what food resources they're using at any portion of the season. Deer are gonna feed almost every single day. So knowing what food resources is most attractive at that time of year is a big key to put more venison in your freezer. For those states where season is already open or about to open, at this time of year, deer are making a shift, and that can really booger some folks up when they've been maybe scouting deer or seen them on their trail camera, and all of a sudden hunting season opens and the deer are not there or not on that same pattern. Deer are going through a change from going from needing a lot of protein, finishing developing antlers, still lactating or nursing fawns. Those are heavily dependent on a high protein diet. But once bucks start hardening antlers and some fawns are starting to wean off, deer are shifting to food sources high in carbohydrates. They're building energy to store body fat for the winter. Even in the South, deer are genetically predisposed or genetically programmed to store fat. And about this time of year, you'll see deer switch from really high quality protein plants to those that are higher in energy. As an example here at the Proving Grounds, we're seeing deer switch to a component in our blends that's Milo. Milo is full of energy. They haven't touched it all summer because it's low in protein. It's now starting to make that grain head, which is perfect because it's making a grain head before acorns drop. Deer are seeking carbohydrates, so if you've got the only carbs in the area, i.e. a good blend with some Milo in there, you know where the deer are going. It won't be long till acorns will be falling in some areas, and acorns are also rich in carbohydrates and low in protein. Now acorns aren't quite as good as Milo because they're full of tannic acid. Red oaks have more than white oaks, and that acid can bind to calcium in the deer system and make it somewhat unavailable to the deer. But they're a big food source throughout much of the whitetails range. Deer really prefer white oak acorns. We've talked in the past to identify a white oak leaf. And when white oaks are hitting the ground, you better have a stand or a blind overlooking that white oak area on a travel corridor leading to or coming from white oaks, because deer are going to white oaks when they're available. Here in southern Missouri, white oaks don't typically start to fall till mid-October, maybe early October, depending on the year. And this year, we've had a wicked drought and a little bit of a late frost, so I'm not seeing many white oak acorns in trees when I'm hanging stands or checking stands. That's why a really good food plot is going to be critical throughout much of the whitetails range this year. I'm talking to a lot of other people that aren't seeing many acorns when they're out scouting. I'm sure there are pockets of great acorn production, but this is another tip. Don't wait to find that, second, third, fourth week of hunting season. Go out now with your optics, be looking around and see if trees in your hunting area are holding many acorns. By this time of year, they should be big enough, even in the tops of the trees, to spot with a good pair of binos. Even when deer are feeding heavy on white oak acorns, they're often come to a high quality food plot. That young vegetation, that new fall crop that's 3-4 inches tall is extremely palatable, again, if you're planting a good blend. I always like blends over a single species. There's no single species, just like there's no magic bean that will cover all the bases. It's not going to be palatable early, mid, and late season, drought resistant, does okay with a lot of moisture. It just doesn't exist. So blends are the best way to go to ensure you have something that's going to attract deer early, mid, and late season. That early season attraction is important because remember, every day deer season goes on, there's probably fewer bucks out there to wrap a tag on because some of those bucks are going to be harvested or roadkill or later on injured in fighting. It's also much easier to pattern deer before the pre-rut or rut. And one big secret to having success during the early season is having a hideo food plot, a small food plot with a good blend growing. And I like those hideos, 50, 70 yards away from thick cover, an area that deer like to bed in. Maybe that bedding area is off a steep slope or a swamp, and they're coming up just a little bit to get in that hideo food plot. Now, if it's a half mile away, they may not make it to that hideo food plot before it gets dark or during legal shooting light. That's why I'm willing to risk it and create those hideo food plots close to cover, but I'm always thinking about how I'm going to approach, hunt, and exit. A lot of people forget the exit without alerting deer. You may not tag that buck the first time you hunt it, so being able to exit cleanly, get away from there, makes that spot just as good to hunt the next day. During the early season, of course, there's not rut activity going on throughout much of the whitetails range. Food is the key, unless it's wicked dry. If it's wicked dry and there are limited water resources, water may be the key. And you know that because if it's wicked dry, it'll be obvious. Not just kind of dry, but wicked dry. That's rarely an issue, thankfully, throughout much of the whitetails range, unless you're in West Texas or places like that. But when it is wicked dry, go find those sources of water, and I prefer a source of water that are on a ridge top. Remember that the wind is almost always more constant on a ridge top than in a valley. And you don't want a swirling wind. A swirling wind puts the odds in the deer's favor, not in the hunter's favor. If we know that the wind is blowing out of any direction and likely stay going that way for several hours, then again we can approach, hunt, and exit and really reduce our chances of alerting deer. I'm a morning person. I wake up early almost every day without an alarm clock. But during the early season, I almost exclusively hunt during the afternoons.
Growing Deer is brought to you by Bass Pro Shops and Cabela's. Also by Green Cover Food Plots, Winchester, Moultrie Mobile, Fleet Outdoor Apparel, Morel Targets, RTP Outdoors, Fourth Arrow, Scorpion Venom Archery, Case IH Tractors, Ward Laboratories, Burris Optics, National Land Realty, G5 Broadheads, Prime Bows, and Redneck Hunting Blinds.
Through bunches and bunches of deer wearing a GPS collar and before that a radio collar, we know unequivocally deer are primarily crepuscular. That's a big fancy science word which means deer move pretty much around dawn and dusk, daylight and dark. That's even more true when it's really hot outside. If it's hotter than normal, it seems you won't see a lot of movement later in the morning or early afternoon. But when they're moving in the morning, before daylight, and you're trying to get to your blind before daylight, they're moving, you're moving, there's a pretty good chance you're gonna alert deer going to your hunting destination. I think there's probably more movement in the morning, a few more minutes of daylight that they're moving compared to the afternoon. But in the afternoon, especially during the early season when it's warm, deer tend to hang in that bedding area, in the shade, or in that bedding area, that secure area, longer, and move just before it gets dark and it starts cooling off just a little bit out to feed. As I mentioned earlier, having those hideo food plots 50 yards, 75 yards away from that bedding area can be a ticket to harvesting a mature buck during the early season. And knowing that deer are moving in the morning when you're moving, it's just tough to get in there. But if you find that magical spot, maybe deer over here on this acorn flat or big bean field or something, they're coming back here to bed and you can get in front of them without alerting deer, then mornings are my favorite time to hunt. But you've got to know deer are going to a location, typically an ag field or an acorn flat, and they're not bedding there. If you don't have that figured out, I personally would not risk hunting in the morning. I'd do my work, my chores at that time, and save my hunting time for the afternoon when deer are most likely to be bedded down and you can move into a hunting position with much better odds of not alerting a deer. For those of y'all that hunt cropland, you're in that ag belt, Ohio all the way through the Dakotas, kind of that ag belt. You need to remember that deer have been feeding in those bean fields or whatever just like clockwork, but that combine's coming. And once that field either matures, those beans start turning brown or yellow, or the combine takes them off, that food source just disappeared. And deer are most likely going to use a different part of their home range. So if you're hunting that area, if you don't own the land, it would be wise to visit with the farmer and say, hey, when are you going to harvest these beans? Or even a better question, when do you think these beans are going to mature? When do you think the leaves are going to start turning color? Because once those leaves start turning color, they become unpalatable to deer, and deer are going somewhere else to feed. So if you're in ag country and you've scouted all summer, remember, all those patterns could change significantly once the combines hit the field. That's why there's huge advantages to knowing your property really well or scouting throughout the season. You want to stay on top of those current food sources. Maybe a persimmon tree is dropping, or the acorn started falling, or again, the farmer cut the beans, or whatever's going on. Deer have no problem using different portions of their home range. They don't go out of their home range much. That's kind of a myth. But within their home range, they shift portions depending on the resources they need and their availability. Dry, they may shift to water. Hunting pressure, they may shift to areas where humans aren't going or there's less hunting pressure. Food sources can change overnight, and they can certainly shift that quick. Understanding deer behavior, biology if you will, and the habitat is a big portion of the fun I receive from deer hunting. But something even more important than understanding deer behavior and habitat preferences is understanding God's will for our lives and taking time to seek it and apply it daily. Thanks for watching Growing Deer.